Now, Colin Pitchfork, the rapist and murderer who killed two schoolgirls in 1988, is staging a fresh bid for freedom, believe it or not, having won an appeal for yet another parole hearing. Barbara Ashworth, the mother of one of his victims, has expressed anger at the decision, saying she would throw away the key. One person who has campaigned relentlessly against the release of Colin Pitchfork is Conservative MP Alberto Costa. Welcome, Alberto. Nice to see you again.
Pleasure to see you, Mike. I wish it was under better circumstances, but both of us seem to be on this merry-go-round every time I come onto your excellent programme. Unfortunately, we're talking about the case of Colin Pitchfork. This is a never-ending saga. Well, it's becoming a saga, Mike, and I know that a lot of your audience, and I'm sure you yourself would agree with me, that there's something wrong with the parole board when we can have these endless panel hearings that either release him or then recall him back into prison, then release him again or propose to release him. We're just going round and round in circles. But I tell you this, Mike, I'm not going to tire of raising this matter, not least because, as you rightly said, there were two young women that were brutally raped and murdered by Pitchfork, Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth, and we must never forget them. And we must remember their families and friends who continue to suffer today.
Exactly right. And they were only 15 years of age, and the two murders and rapes were quite far apart from one another. But you know what I didn't know until today, and I was listening to TalkTV, watching it this afternoon. Peter Blexley was on, saying that there's a hideous kind of record in Pitchfork's history, whereby when he was originally done for indecent exposure before he went on his kind of killing spree, that he basically admitted to something like 1,000 other offences of sexual impropriety in one way or another. So, I mean, he's clearly a man who is not rehabilitatable, if you like.
Well, whether he's been rehabilitated or not, we're changing the law about how we deal with sexual offences and crimes of murder against women in particular. And I think that's right. Whole life orders are being proposed. And what that basically means is if somebody like Pitchfork was to commit one of those brutal crimes today, they would likely get a whole life order, meaning that they would spend most, if not all, of their natural life in prison, regardless of whether they've been rehabilitated or not. The problem that we've got is these legacy cases, which were judged under a different criminal law sanctions regime. And so Pitchfork has the right to apply for parole, but he doesn't have the right to have parole. And let's remember that even if parole's granted, it's granted on licence. So in case anybody thinks that, oh, he served his time, he's got the right to come out, that's not the case. He's got the right to apply, but not the right to be granted it.
Exactly.
But where we are today, Mike, is that, let's remember in 2021, the parole board disgracefully released Colin Pitchfork. And within 2 months, he was recalled back into prison. And then last spring, once again, the parole board had a hearing. I was the first MP invited to observe that hearing. And what did they do? Once again, they decided to release him. I applied to the Secretary of State for Justice to ask the parole board to reconsider. He did that. The parole board appointed an independent panel. They agreed that the Secretary of State's grounds that it was irrational to release him were worth having a new panel. A new panel was constituted. And only 2 months ago, in December of last year, that new parole panel decided that it would be wrong to release Colin Pitchfork. And let me tell you why. They decided this, among other things, because Colin Pitchfork could not demonstrate to the parole panel that his attitude towards women had changed. So they rightly decided not to release him. And what's Pitchfork done? He's put in an application saying, wait for it, that it would be irrational not to release him. You can't make this up.
No.
So I spoke to the Secretary of State for Justice yesterday about this urgently, and I'm in communications with his team. And I'm pleased that the government have made an announcement yesterday that the situation is unacceptable, that this is a flawed decision on top of a flawed decision. So I know that the Secretary of State for Justice is asking for an urgent meeting with the parole board. But let me repeat, Mike, I'm very grateful to you and other media outlets for allowing me to speak on this issue, because we must never, ever stop our campaign to keep this dangerous man in the only place that he deserves to be, which is in a prison.
And the last time that he was actually physically released, we discovered by accident almost that he'd been in a kind of open prison situation for a while, and he'd been walking around freely most days of the week and sort of returning to the prison in the evenings. And of course, the reason that you and I think this guy should never be released, as well as all of the things you've said, is that when he was out, he was found hanging around a girls' school, which was a breach of his parole conditions. And so, you know, you don't have to be a genius to work out what he was doing there and why he shouldn't be able to do it again.
Well, all I can say is this, Mike, that I observed the parole board hearing. I signed a confidentiality agreement, rightly, and I won't disclose what I saw or heard at that parole board hearing last spring. But what I will say is this: if you rape and murder anyone, let alone a young person, a woman, you should be put in prison for the rest of your natural life. And that's why I support the government's proposals for whole life orders. I think that's the right move. The challenge we've got is with these legacy cases. How do we deal with Pitchfork? Well, I've got a simple solution for the parole board. It's not obliged to grant parole to Pitchfork. It's obliged to listen to his application. And there's plenty of evidence that the parole board can consider and base its decision on. And I'm hoping that when they decide on this matter yet again, that they will say no to Mr. Pitchfork. And finally, this, Mike, the parole board rules themselves need to be changed. We cannot have a situation where a prisoner can limitlessly apply an appeal on top of an appeal. That just doesn't make sense. That's not right.
No.
So we need to change these rules, tweak them to ensure that there is only one internal review, not a succession, a limitless number of internal reviews. That cannot provide the certainty that the families and victims of Pitchfork deserve.
No, absolutely right. Alberto, with you all the way. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. Alberto Costa, MP, who, as I say, has fought absolutely relentlessly to make sure that the communities that were so badly affected by Pitchfork's acts are not subject to his release, because, of course, as he said, one of the victims' mothers is still available. The family is still around. They don't want to see him out on the streets.